No one remembers when the chain started breathing, but everyone remembers when it stopped. The hall was a mile long, measured in cold metal ribs and columns of liquid gold flowing like slow rivers along the walls, each drop catching light that never flickered, never warmed, just existed, steady and indifferent, as if the place itself had forgotten what heat was supposed to feel like. At the far center stood the thing no one looked at, not directly, not ever. A figure suspended in a lattice of pale alloy links that pulsed every few seconds. A quiet inhale, a dim blue glow under the surface, then a slow exhale, fading again, like something alive pretending not to be. Ethan Cole noticed it immediately, because it was the only thing in the room that didn't move when he entered, boots scraping softly across a polished floor that reflected him too clearly, a man out of place, dust still clinging to the seams of his work jacket, oxygen gauge flickering on his wrist at 68%, heart rate elevated but steady, the kind of steady that came from not understanding what you were supposed to be afraid of yet. Around him, rows of figures bowed low, their forms elegant and rigid, armor grown instead of built, their attention fixed forward toward the throne where the alien king rested, tall and luminous, every inch of him reflecting power not by volume, but by stillness, the kind that made sound feel like an intrusion. "You survived," the king said, voice layered like overlapping frequencies, not loud but impossible to ignore, and with a single gesture the gold along the wall surged forward, pooling at Ethan's feet in a slow, deliberate tide, thick as syrup, bright enough to sting the eyes, measured in pounds beyond counting, enough to buy a planet, or at least whatever passed for one out here. Ethan didn't step back, didn't step forward either, just stood there, breathing in air that smelled faintly of ozone and something sterile, something ancient, his gaze drifting, not to the gold, not to the throne, but back to the figure in chains, because something about it felt wrong in a way he couldn't name, like a tool placed where a person should be or the other way around. The chain pulsed again, a soft blue ripple traveling link to link, and for half a second, less than that, he thought, he saw a hand inside shift, not struggling, not reaching, just adjusting, as if it had been waiting long enough to forget the difference between stillness and choice. A guard nearest the structure angled slightly away, subtle but deliberate, and that was when Ethan understood the room, not the language, not the rules, just the gravity of that one presence everyone else pretended didn't exist. "Take it," the king said, and the gold crept closer by inches, closing the last foot between them, reflecting Ethan's face back at him in warped fragments, eyes, jaw, a man divided into shining pieces. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound loud in his own ears, and took one step, not toward the gold, but off its edge, the metal cooling under his boot as he moved past the offered fortune and toward the only thing in the hall that seemed to breathe. The gold did not follow him, and that was the first sign something had changed, because everything in that room moved with intention except him. Ethan Cole walked across the polished floor with a steady pace, each step measured in quiet defiance, the soft hum of the structure growing louder the closer he came to the chained figure, until it was no longer a sound but a rhythm, slow and controlled, like a heartbeat stretched across centuries. The air shifted near the structure, cooler by a few degrees, enough for the sensors on his wrist to register a drop. 68% oxygen holding steady, but the pressure felt different, like standing near a sealed chamber that was not meant to be opened. Behind him, no one spoke, not the guards, not the courtiers, not even the king, and that silence pressed harder than any command could have. Ethan stopped 3 feet from the chain and finally saw it clearly. Not a prison in the way he understood, but something precise, engineered, each link etched with patterns that glowed faintly between pulses, as if they were not restraining strength but regulating it, containing something that did not belong to ordinary space. The figure inside remained still, head slightly lowered, strands of pale light drifting from her skin like mist caught in slow motion. Her form slender but not fragile, more like something condensed into shape rather than born into it. Ethan tilted his head, studying the way the light beneath her skin flickered, not randomly but in response, and when he shifted his weight forward by an inch, the glow answered, just slightly brighter, just slightly faster. "Stop," One of the guards said, the word quiet but edged with something unfamiliar, not authority, not anger, but caution. Ethan did not stop. He raised his hand slowly, fingers open, showing nothing, offering nothing, just presence. And as his palm hovered inches from the nearest link, the chain reacted first, its surface heating, numbers on his wrist, climbing past 150 degrees Fahrenheit, then 180, then higher, but he did not pull away, because the heat felt wrong, not like a warning, more like a test. Then something else happened, something smaller, almost invisible. The figure inside moved, not a struggle, not resistance, just a shift of her hand, aligning with his through the barrier, matching distance, matching angle, as if the 2 points in space had agreed to meet halfway without touching. The glow intensified, spreading through the chain in a ripple that traveled outward, link to link, faster now, and somewhere behind him, a step echoed, the king descending from the throne, not rushing, never rushing, but no longer still. You are selecting incorrectly, the king said, voice lower now, closer, the layered tones narrowing into something almost human. Almost. Ethan did not look back, his eyes fixed on the faint outline of her fingers mirroring his own, separated by inches of engineered silence, and he spoke without raising his voice. Then why is she the only thing in this room that reacts to me? And for the first time since he had entered, the rhythm of the chain faltered, just once, just enough to prove it had been listening. The chain did not resume its rhythm right away, and that single hesitation changed the room more than any command ever could, because now everyone saw it, not the girl, not the human, but the system itself losing certainty. Ethan kept his hand where it was, hovering inches from the glowing alloy, skin flushed from the heat that had climbed past 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet somehow no pain settled in, only pressure, like standing too close to something vast and quiet. The girl inside lifted her head fully for the first time, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough for the light beneath her skin to reveal the shape of her face, smooth and unreadable, her eyes still closed but no longer distant, as if she had moved from somewhere far away to just behind the surface. The king stepped closer, each movement measured in exact inches, the floor responding with a low resonance that matched his presence. And when he stopped 10 feet behind Ethan, the air tightened again, returning structure to the moment. She responds to variables, the king said, voice controlled, layered tones aligning back into authority, not to intention. But even as he spoke, the chain flickered again, a faint ripple traveling outward from the point nearest Ethan's hand, contradicting the statement without sound. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching the reflection of the blue light across his fingers, noticing how it did not scatter like ordinary light, but bent slightly inward, drawn toward her, like gravity had shifted direction by a fraction. Then she is choosing wrong, Ethan said quietly, not as a challenge, just an observation. And that was when the girl's eyes opened. They were not bright at first, not glowing, just clear, a pale blue that deepened by degrees as if light was arriving from a distance measured in years, not seconds. And when they settled on his hand, the temperature reading on his wrist dropped suddenly, from 200 to 100, then lower, stabilizing at something almost human. The chain responded immediately, its glow no longer pulsing outward but inward, collapsing toward her form, each link dimming in sequence as though releasing something it had been holding for too long. A murmur moved through the hall, subtle but unmistakable, the first sign that control was no longer absolute. The king did not raise his voice, but his next step carried weight, the kind that redefined space. And when he spoke again, it was directed not at Ethan but at the girl. You will remain. A statement, not a command. Something that had always been true until now. The girl did not look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on Ethan, on the space between their hands, and slowly, deliberately, she moved closer, closing the gap by a single inch, the chain adjusting with her, not resisting, not tightening, just following. Ethan did not move to meet her. He held still, letting her decide the distance. And when her fingers finally touched the inner surface of the link opposite his, the entire structure exhaled. A long, low release of energy that dimmed the gold along the walls by a fraction, just enough for the room to feel less certain of itself. No alarms sounded, no force intervened. But something deeper shifted, something written into the system long before anyone in the hall had been born. And in that quiet change, Ethan understood one thing with absolute clarity: he had not been offered a reward. He had been placed in front of a question, and for the first time in 200 years, the answer had changed. The moment their fingers aligned across the barrier, the room did not react with force. It reacted with uncertainty. And that was far more dangerous because nothing in this place had been designed to hesitate. Ethan felt it first in the air, a subtle shift in pressure, like a sealed system trying to recalculate itself, while the chain between them dimmed another degree, its glow no longer steady but searching. As if it had lost the exact rule it was meant to follow, the girl's eyes remained fixed on his, unblinking, not curious, not afraid, just present in a way that made everything else feel distant. And when she moved again, it was not toward escape, it was toward alignment, adjusting her hand by a fraction of an inch until their palms matched perfectly through the thin barrier of alloy. And for a brief second, the light beneath her skin synchronized with his pulse, not identical, but close enough to suggest a pattern forming. Behind him, the king did not step closer this time. And that absence of movement carried more weight than any command, because it meant he was observing something he did not fully control. "You are interfering with a closed system," the king said, voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty, as if each word had to be measured before it was allowed to exist, and the guards along the perimeter shifted their stance by a precise angle, not advancing, not retreating, simply preparing for outcomes that had never been required before. Ethan did not respond immediately, his attention still anchored to the contact point, to the way the heat had faded into something almost neutral, a steady warmth that felt less like resistance and more like recognition. And when he finally spoke, it was not directed at the king, but at the space between him and the girl. Then it was not closed, he said, voice even, grounded, the kind of tone that belonged to someone fixing a machine rather than challenging a ruler. The chain reacted again, not with light this time, but with structure, each link loosening by an imperceptible margin, recalibrating, as though the definition of containment had shifted from absolute to conditional. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him now, not the surface, not the form, but something deeper, something that required stillness to measure. And in that silence, her hand pressed just a fraction closer to the barrier, enough that the thin layer of alloy between them began to fade at the edges, not breaking, not dissolving, but becoming less certain of its own boundary. A low resonance moved through the hall, subtle but continuous, like a system running diagnostics across itself, and the gold along the walls dimmed further, losing its brilliance by degrees, as if attention was being redirected away from wealth and towards something far less predictable. "You will step away," the king said, not louder, but firmer now, an attempt to restore definition, to return the moment to something known. But Ethan did not move, because for the first time since entering the hall, he understood the scale of what was happening, not in terms of power, but in terms of choice. And he realized that the girl was not responding to strength, or command, or value. She was responding to the absence of all three. The barrier between their hands thinned another fraction, and for a brief instant, just under a second, he felt it. Not heat, not pressure, but contact, real and undeniable. And the system, unable to classify what it had just allowed, paused completely, every light, every sound, every process in the hall holding still, as if the universe itself needed a moment to understand what had just been permitted. The contact lasted less than a second, but the absence it left behind was immediate, like a sound cut from the air before it could echo, and Ethan felt it in his chest more than his hand, a quiet recognition that something irreversible had already happened. The barrier did not fully return, it shimmered instead, thin and uncertain, as though it no longer trusted its own purpose. And the chain surrounding the girl responded in kind, each link losing definition at the edges, no longer perfectly aligned, no longer perfectly controlled. The girl did not pull away, her hand remained where it had been, fingers relaxed, not reaching, not retreating, simply existing in a space that had just proven it could change. Her eyes stayed on his, steady and clear, and for the first time there was something new behind them, not emotion as he understood it, but direction. A subtle shift from observation to decision. The hall reacted slowly, almost reluctantly, a low hum building beneath the floor as systems attempted to reassert order. Light returning in uneven waves along the walls, the gold brightening in segments instead of flowing as one, as if the structure itself was no longer synchronized. "You have crossed a threshold that was not offered," the king said, his voice now carrying a precise edge, not raised, not forceful, but sharpened by something closer to concern than authority. And when he took a single step forward, the distance between him and Ethan closed to less than 8 feet, a proximity that carried weight without needing motion. Ethan finally lowered his hand by an inch, not breaking the connection entirely, just enough to feel the absence of that brief contact. And he glanced at the chain again, noticing how the symbols etched into its surface were no longer consistent, patterns shifting in real time, rewriting themselves in response to something they could not categorize. Then maybe it should have been, Ethan said, his voice calm, not defiant, simply stating what now felt obvious, and the girl's gaze flickered, not away from him, but deeper, as if she was measuring the meaning behind the words rather than the sound itself. The temperature around them stabilized, neither cold nor warm, a neutral field that did not belong to the rest of the hall, and within that space, the chain loosened again, not dramatically, not enough to release, but enough to redefine what holding meant. One of the guards shifted closer, then stopped, as if an unseen boundary had formed, something intangible but absolute, and even the king paused, his presence still dominant, still vast, but no longer unquestioned. The girl moved her hand slightly, not toward him this time, but downward, tracing the inner curve of the chain as if mapping it from within, and wherever her fingers passed, the glow dimmed, not extinguished, but quieted, like a system being asked to listen instead of enforce. Ethan watched closely, realizing that she was not trying to break anything. She was learning it, understanding the structure that had defined her for 200 years, and in that understanding, something more powerful than force began to take shape. The hall fell into a deeper silence, not the controlled silence of authority, but the uncertain silence of transition. And in that space, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be decided by strength, or command, or even design, but by the simple fact that for the first time, the system had been met with something it had never been built to answer. The chain no longer behaved like a command, it behaved like a question, and that difference spread through the hall in ways no one could measure, because every system built to enforce certainty now faced something that did not resist, did not comply, but simply existed outside the expected response. Ethan remained still, his hand lowered but not withdrawn, his presence unchanged, and that consistency became its own kind of signal, something the structure could not override because it did not trigger any of the conditions it had been designed to correct. The girl continued tracing the inner curve of the chain, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, each motion followed by a soft dimming of the symbols beneath her touch, as if she was not disabling them, but teaching them a different function. Her eyes never left his for long, always returning, always recalibrating, as though his presence anchored the process in a way the system alone never could. The temperature across the chamber stabilized completely now, the previous gradients of cold authority and sterile precision flattening into something neutral, almost breathable, and the gold along the walls no longer flowed. It rested, suspended in place as if waiting for instruction that would not come. "You are altering a containment protocol that has remained unchanged for 2 centuries, the king said, and this time there was no layered distortion in his voice. Only a single tone, clear and controlled, but stripped of the absolute certainty it once carried. It was not designed to adapt, and yet the chain continued to shift, its links spacing by fractions, its light responding not to force but to proximity, to alignment, to something as simple and unquantifiable as choice. Ethan finally turned his head slightly, enough to acknowledge the king without breaking the moment, and he spoke with the same steady tone he had carried since the beginning. "Then it is not containment," he said. "It is delay." And the words settled into the room like a new variable, something that could not be removed once introduced. The girl paused her movement for the first time since she began. her hand resting against the inner surface of the chain, and her gaze deepened, not brighter, not sharper, just more focused, as if the concept had reached her in a way the system never had. A low resonance built beneath the floor again, but this time it was uneven, fluctuating in intervals that did not match any known pattern, and the guards along the perimeter shifted once more, not in unison, but individually, each adjusting based on instinct rather than directive. The chain reacted to her stillness, its glow stabilizing, no longer pulsing, no longer searching, simply present, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, one of the links nearest her hand separated by less than an inch, not breaking, not unlocking, just allowing space where none had existed before. Ethan noticed it immediately, not because of the movement, but because of the absence of resistance, and he felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, not victory, just confirmation that the system had already begun to change before anyone had given it permission. The king took another step forward, stopping at exactly 6 feet, a distance that now felt intentional rather than absolute. And for the first time, he did not issue a command. He asked a question. What are you doing? Not to Ethan, not entirely, but to the moment itself. And in that quiet shift from authority to inquiry, the balance of the hall tilted, not toward chaos, but toward something far more unfamiliar, something that could no longer be controlled by design alone. The girl finally spoke, her voice soft, precise, carrying no strain, no urgency, only clarity. I am remembering. And as the words settled into the air, the chain responded not by tightening, but by loosening again, as if the act of being remembered was the one condition it had never been built to contain. The hall remained suspended in that delicate tension, the glow of the chain dimmed to a soft blue that filled the space. With a quiet awareness, and Ethan Cole stepped closer, boots making no sound against the polished metal, each step measured and deliberate, a human moving through a world built for the incomprehensible. The girl inside the chain tilted her head, eyes still locked on him, and for the first time in centuries, her posture suggested trust rather than compliance, a subtle alignment of presence that the king could not quantify. The air itself seemed to change, the heavy metallic scent shifting to something lighter, like the scent of ozone after a storm, and even the gold along the walls reflected this subtle alteration, not in brilliance but in the way light seemed to pause before bouncing off each surface. You are risking everything, the king said, voice steady, a statement rather than a threat, as he stepped back slightly, acknowledging that his control had weakened, not defeated, just reassessed. Ethan did not respond with words. His hand extended carefully, touching the inner surface of the chain opposite hers, and the moment their fingers aligned, even through the thin alloy, a ripple traveled along the links, the glow intensifying and spreading, as if the structure itself was aware of the choice being made and had no alternative but to yield. The girl exhaled softly, a sound carried more in thought than in air, and the chain relaxed incrementally, links adjusting, not releasing entirely, but creating space where none had existed for 200 years. The king remained silent, watching the interaction, observing the impossibility of human instinct meeting alien engineering and effecting change without confrontation. Ethan leaned slightly forward, not in aggression but in presence, and the girl mirrored him, shifting so that their alignment was perfect, the subtle glow beneath her skin syncing with the residual warmth on his fingers, a connection that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with recognition. The hall seemed to breathe. With them, the hum of the structure fluctuating, pauses lengthening and shortening, as if it, too, were learning, recalibrating to accommodate an event it had never anticipated. The guards along the perimeter tensed, then relaxed, responding to the absence of expected conflict, and the gold on the walls shimmered unevenly, not in chaotic motion but in reflective acknowledgement of the shift in energy. Ethan finally spoke, voice calm, deliberate. It is not about control, and the words resonated through the room, not as argument but as fact, and the girl shifted slightly, nodding once, the smallest motion, yet monumental in consequence, as the chain pulsed and dimmed further, yielding a small but definitive space between the links. The king stepped back another pace, his presence less imposing, less certain, and Ethan realized that the moment had evolved beyond human or alien design. A threshold crossed not through force but through choice, recognition, and silent understanding, and as the light between them softened into a steady glow, the hall seemed to settle, waiting, watching, for what would come next, knowing that the next movement, small as it might be, could redefine everything that had been understood about containment, obedience, and the simple act of choosing someone over everything else. The room seemed to hold its breath as the chain continued to shift, each link bending subtly, responding not to force but to the presence of understanding. And Ethan Cole took another careful step closer, boots silent against the polished metal, his hand reaching once more toward the space between himself and the girl. Her eyes opened fully now, revealing a pale blue depth that shimmered faintly with an inner light. And in that gaze was recognition, not awe, not fear, simply comprehension, as if she had waited 200 years for someone to see her as she truly was. The chain itself dimmed incrementally, the glow softening into a gentle pulse. And for the first time the structure surrounding her did not resist, it yielded, creating an allowance, a breathing space, that was previously unimaginable, and the gold along the walls reflected this change in muted flashes, like sunlight passing through fog. Uneven but beautiful. The king stepped back, silent, watching, not interfering, as though he had learned to measure power in something other than control, and the guards along the perimeter adjusted their positions, each aware that this moment had already shifted the rules they had followed for generations. Ethan's hand moved forward with deliberate calm, hovering over the chain, his fingers brushing the surface without pressure, and the girl mirrored the gesture on her side, their movements synchronized without planning, without words, an unspoken dialogue across the thin alloy barrier. The air was lighter here, carrying a faint hum of energy, subtle vibrations that neither heat nor wind could explain, and with each pulse, the chain responded, loosening further, as if acknowledging a decision made outside of its programmed logic. A low, rhythmic resonance built beneath the floor, uneven, unpredictable, yet steady in its own pattern, signaling that the hall, the systems, and even the king himself were witnessing something new, a shift not enforced but chosen. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of centuries in that single moment, and he spoke softly, voice carrying across the space without raising. It is not about chains, it is about presence. And the girl tilted her head slightly, a subtle nod, her fingers pressing gently against the link in alignment with his touch, the chain responding by loosening another fraction of an inch. The king made no motion to intervene, his expression unreadable, but the glow of his armor reflected faintly on the walls in patterns that seemed almost uncertain, as if the very light acknowledged that the hierarchy in this room was being recalculated. Ethan did not withdraw, he did not pause, he simply maintained his position, allowing the girl to adjust her own movements. And in that mutual respect for presence rather than power, the chain yielded fully, links sliding to the side to form space that had been unthinkable moments before. A subtle warmth settled in the room, not oppressive, not artificial, just enough to remind everyone present that living things were in the room, breathing, choosing, interacting. And in that quiet harmony, the hall seemed to recognize the extraordinary act, holding the moment indefinitely, waiting to see what would come next as the girl finally lifted her gaze toward the king, steady, unwavering, and spoke, voice soft but clear, "I am free now, because someone dared to see me." The hall fell silent in a way that carried more weight than any spoken decree, the gold along the walls reflecting soft fragments of the light from the chain as it now rested entirely around the girl, links aligned yet no longer constraining, just present. And Ethan Cole stood still, his hand lowered but his presence unwavering, a human being whose choice had shifted the rules of a system built to last centuries. The girl lifted her head fully, pale blue eyes meeting his with clarity, and in that gaze there was acknowledgement, not gratitude, not command, just recognition of an action that transcended expectation and authority. The king remained in place, observing, his armor dimly glowing in the ambient light, every subtle movement of his body measured, aware that power had been challenged without confrontation and that the structure of his domain had yielded in response to presence and understanding rather than force. The guards shifted, uneasily, as the hum of the hall continued, low and steady, a resonance that had once signaled control now echoing in absence of it. A recalibration of priorities, awaiting for the next motion to define what would come next, and the soft glow from the chain cast elongated reflections across the polished floor, catching on the curves of Ethan's work jacket, the subtle shimmer in the girl's hair, the polished edges of the walls, the effect of light bending around presence rather than object. Ethan took a measured breath, feeling the weight of centuries of expectation settle into something mutable, and he stepped slightly forward, closing the distance just enough that their shoulders were nearly aligned, and she responded with a slow, deliberate tilt, mirroring his movement in perfect, silent harmony. The room seemed to contract around them. No sound, no vibration except the chain's steady pulse and the soft hum beneath the floor, and for the first time since he had entered, Ethan understood that he had not been offered a reward, nor had he exercised control, but had simply made a choice visible enough to shift the perception of every system, every observer, every entity in the hall. The girl's hand moved slightly, brushing against his palm through the inner surface of the chain without pressure, a gesture that held the weight of centuries in stillness. And as their fingers aligned briefly, the light beneath her skin pulsed once, steady and complete, a signal that recognition had been achieved without word, without ceremony, without expectation. The king finally exhaled, a subtle motion, and did not speak, acknowledging the transformation in the space and the act itself, a silent concession to the human capacity to act without hierarchy, without calculation, and in that quiet, the hall seemed to breathe along with them, every surface, every reflection, every pulse of light, acknowledging that something profound had occurred. Ethan looked at her, eyes meeting in the steady pulse of recognition, and he knew that whatever the future held, the moment they had shared, the decision made, and the silent trust established would resonate far beyond the polished metal walls, beyond the gold, beyond the engineered control. And as the soft blue glow of her skin reflected across his face, he realized that humanity, in its simplest form, had not just acted, it had been understood.